Good day everyone, I am PATRICE ALLYSON, a CANTOS, and to continue our discussion, I'll be discussing the remaining categories of literary theory. Literary theory has 8 categories, by the way, and Miss Julianne Torno had already discussed the first 3 categories earlier. And now I am going to proceed to the 4th category. The 4th category, by the way, is structuralism and post-structuralism. Structuralism sought to bring to literary studies a set of objective criteria for analysis and a new intellectual rigor, relied initially on the ideas of the Swiss linguist. Structuralism is a theoretical approach that identifies patterns and social arrangement, mostly notably language. While post-structuralism builds on the insights of the structuralism, it holds all meaning to be fluid rather than universal and predictable. Moreover, structuralism as a literary movement primarily concerned with understanding how language works as a system of meaning production. That is to say, structuralism asks the following question: how does language function as a kind of meaning machine? To answer this question, structuralism turned its attention to form, focusing on the form or structure of the literary work, and the particular use of language in the work would allow structuralism to think of language as a kind of science. The primary theorist framing the ideas associated with structuralism was Ferdinand de Saussure, who developed the idea that language was composed of arbitrary units that were void of concept or meaning until they required meaning through a language system that relied on differences between terms within their larger linguistic and social context. Post-structuralism, on the other hand, is less singularly defined as a movement than structuralism. A number of literary theories fall under the larger umbrella of post-structuralism, including gender theory and reader response theories. These theories rather recognize the overarching notion that meaning does not exist outside of the text and that meaning is not fixed but rather contingent and unstable. Post-structuralism evolved alongside Jacques Derrida's theory of deconstruction, which emphasized the concept of unstable, unfixed meaning as it functions in language. According to Derrida, language is made up of units that do not contain inherent meaning and relate to other units or signifiers through their difference. Meaning, in deconstructionist theory is therefore constantly differed, never landing in one place or becoming stable. Post-structuralism emerged in this context, recognizing this lack of fixed or inherent meaning and yet also acknowledging the need for language to acquire meaning. The 5th category is the new historicism and cultural materialism. New historicism is a term coined by Stephen Greenblatt, designates a body or theoretical and interpretive practices that began largely with the study of early modern literature in the United States. New historicism in America had been somewhat anticipated by the theories of cultural materialism in Britain. New historicism and cultural materialism seek to understand literary texts historically and reject the formalizing influence of previous literary studies, including new criticism, structuralism, and deconstruction, all of which in varying ways privilege the literary text and place only secondary emphasis on historical and social context. In addition, the key difference between the new historicism and cultural materialism is that new historicism focuses on the oppression in the society that has to be overcome in order to achieve changes, whereas cultural materialism focuses on how the change is brought about. New historism and cultural materialism have become two of the most powerful appealing movement in modern criticism. Their initial conquest of Renaissance studies has escalated into a global colonization of English and American literary history. A wealth of innovative work has emerged on everything from the contemporary tales of and bringing intense theoretical controversy on its wake. This reader fools the diversity and polemical vigor of this new critical constellation into focus for the first time. The introduction identifies the key concerns of both approaches, unpacks their theoretical assumptions, and clarifies their chief points of convergence and antagonism. The sixth category is ethnic studies and post-colonial criticism. Ethnic studies concern itself generally with art and literature produced by identifiable ethnic groups, either marginalized or in a subordinate position to a dominant. Post-colonial criticism investigates the relationship between colonized and colonizers in the period and post-colonization. Ethnic studies sometimes refer to a minority studies and has an obvious historical relationship with post-colonial criticism in that Euro-American imperialism and colonization in the last 4 centuries, whether external empire or internal slavery, has been directed at recognizable ethnic groups, African and African American, Chinese, the subaltern peoples of India, Irish, Latino, Native American, and Filipino, among others. Now let's discuss the seventh category, the gender studies and queer theory. Queer theory scholars have developed theories which suggest that gender is fluid, flexible, and subject to change. Judith Butler's work is key to this understanding. She argued that gender is performative, meaning that the performance of gender is what makes gender exist. Butler, 2002. People bring gender into being through gender acts. Such acts are not necessarily deliberate or consciously chosen, but are the repetitive practice that perpetually reproduce gender. For example, wearing makeup, trousers, or skirts, or calling people he or she. Butler suggests that gender does not come from a rooted identity somewhere inside us, but that it only exists through our actions and actions of others in society toward us. Gender reality is performative, which means quite simply that it's the real only to the extent that it is performed. Butler, 1988, 527. This might be thought of as doing gender rather than being gender. Doing gender can be described the interactional process of crafting gender identities that are then presumed to reflect and naturally derive from biology. Gender is performed in relationship to gender norms, either in line with them or transgressing them, or somewhere in between. The relationship to a gender norm is what makes the subject intelligible, either as a conformer or transgressor. Feminist gender theory is postmodern in that it challenges the paradigms and intellectual premises of Western thought, but also takes an activist stance by proposing frequent interventions and alternative epistemological position meant to change the social order. In the context of postmodernism, gender theories, led by the work of Judith Butler, initially viewed the category of gender as a human construct enacted by a vast repetition of social performance. The biological distinction between men and women eventually came under the same scrutiny by theorists, who reached a similar conclusion. The sexual categories are products of culture and as such help create social reality rather than simply reflect. Gender theory achieved a wide readership and acquired much its initial theoretical rigor through the work of a group of French feminist theory. Now we're discussing the last category, the cultural studies. Much of the intellectual legacy of the new historicism and cultural materialism can now be felt in the cultural studies movement in departments of literature, a movement not identifiable in terms of a single theoretical school, but one that embraces a wide array of perspective media studies, social criticism, anthropology, and literary theory. As they apply to the general study of culture, cultural studies arose quite self-consciously in the 80s to provide a means of analysis of the rapidly expanding global structure industry that includes entertainment, advertising, publishing, television, computers, and the internet. Cultural studies brings scrutiny not only these varied categories of culture and not only to the decreasing margins of difference between the realm of expression, but just as importantly to the politics and ideology that make contemporary culture possible. Cultural studies, in addition, became notorious in the 90s for its emphasis on pop music icons and music video in the place of canonical literature and extends the ideas of Frankfurt School on the transition from a truly popular culture to mass culture in late capitalist societies, emphasizing the significance of the patterns of consumption of cultural artifacts. Moreover, cultural studies has been interdisciplinary and even interdisciplinary from its inception indeed. Cultural studies can be understood as a set of sometimes conflicting methods and approaches applied to a questioning of current cultural categories. Stuart Hall, Megan Morris, and Tony Vinay and Simon During are some of the important advocates of a cultural studies that seeks to display the traditional model of literary studies. Cultural studies is a interdisciplinary field that examines the political dynamics and contemporary culture, including popular culture and its historical foundations. Cultural studies researchers generally investigate how cultural practices relate to wider system of power associated with or operating through social phenomena. These include ideology, class structures, national formations, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, and generation. Employing cultural analysis, cultural studies views cultures not as fixed, bounded, stable, and discrete entities, but rather as constantly interacting and changing sets of practices and processes. The field of cultural studies encompasses a range of theoretical and methodological perspectives and practices. Although distinct from the discipline of cultural anthropology and the interdisciplinary field of ethnic studies, cultural studies draw upon and has been contributed to each of these fields. Number 2 is that cultural studies was initially developed by British Marxist academics in the late 1950, 1960, and 1970, and has been subsequently taken up and transformed by scholars from many different disciplines around the world. Cultural studies is avowedly and even radically interdisciplinary and can sometimes be seen as anti-disciplinary. A key concern for cultural studies practitioners is the examination of forces within through which socially organized people conduct and participate in the construction of their everyday lives. Cultural studies combines a variety of politically engaged critical approaches drawn including feminist theory, ethnography and post-structuralism, post-colonialism, social theory, political theory, history, philosophy, literary theory, media theory, film, video studies, communication studies, political economy, translation studies, museum studies, and art history criticism to study cultural phenomena in various society and historical periods. Cultural study seeks to understand how meaning is generated, disseminated, contested, bound up with system of power and control, and produced from the social, political, and economic spheres within a particular social formation and conjuncture. The movement has generated important theories of cultural hegemony and agency. Its practitioners attempt to explain and analyze the cultural forces related and processes globalization. That would be all. Thank you.